Good evening. My name is Kathy Gill. Tonight, we acknowledge the First Nations people of this land. For me, here, it is the Bidjigal and Gadigal people. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future. We also acknowledge the continuous and ongoing custodianship of this land, and that sovereignty has never been ceded. Today, our speakers come from many nations across Australia. We wish to thank our speakers for giving their time to speak out about the impacts of the intervention Stronger Futures laws as they enter their last year of implementation. Tonight is an opportunity to listen and to learn how we can stand in solidarity with First Nations to demand just laws and the full restoration of human rights. We welcome everyone who's listening online. We are recording this event and we do hope to have it online for those not able to attend. If you wish, you may send comments or questions via the chat line. This forum has been organised by the Intervention Rollback Action Group Partway, Alice Springs, Stop the Intervention Collective Sydney, and Concerned Australians. Our three organisations have been speaking out against the injustices of the intervention for many years, and we look forward to its conclusion in June 2022. What we must remain vigilant for is that those draconian measures never see the light of day again. What occurs in 2022 must be a new relationship with First Nations peoples of the Northern Territory, a relationship which will truly acknowledge First Peoples' sovereignty and self-determination. We thank all speakers, and I would like to introduce Alison Whittaker, who has kindly agreed to be our moderator tonight. Alison Whittaker is a Gomeroi writer and a senior researcher at the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. A review in the World Literature Today called her, I quote, Australia's most important recently emerged poet. So thank you again, Alison, and now over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Yama, everybody. I'm Alison Whittaker. I'm a Gomeroi woman, and today I'm coming to you from Gadigal and Wongal country. And I want to take this chance to acknowledge their elders and ancestors and their ongoing sovereignty for this place. And I want to encourage anybody who's here today and is able to type into the chat the country that you're coming from as a way of honouring the country that we are on and the traditional owners who continue to hold it. It's my honour to have you all here today for this final session of the Endless Intervention Conference, First Nations Speak Out. This is the fourth and final session of the conference, organised by the Intervention Rollback Action Rollback Group, the Stop the Intervention Collective, and Concerned Australians, who invited me on to moderate the remarkable lineup that you see before you. It has been 14 years since the commencement of the Northern Territory emergency response, and the First Nations in the Northern Territory still live under its crushing weight and the weight of Stronger Futures legislation. The intervention has devastated mob up north, resulting in loss of community control, governance and assets, the imposition of income management, the denigration of First Nations peoples, rising in incarceration rates, and the pressure to sign over country. Tonight, I'm joined by these astonishing speakers who will share with us their vision for the way forward, stopping the intervention, healing its impacts, and living in those nations' inherent sovereignty going forward. Tonight, our first speaker is Barbara Rachel Shaw. Barbara Rachel Shaw lives at Mount Nancy Town Camp in Mbwanta, Alice Springs. She's a Kaiditch Arunda on her father's side and Warlpiri Warramungu through her mother. Barbara has travelled widely, nationally and internationally, fighting for equality and human rights for her people. Barbara has served as a board member for many Aboriginal organisations and still serves on the ABA Committee and Aboriginal Housing NT, and is a director of the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. She currently works as Deputy Chair of the Central Land Council. Regardless of her many hats and roles, Barbara speaks to the forum as a resident of a town camp living in a prescribed area under the Northern Territory intervention. Please join me in welcoming Barbara. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Sorry about that. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all. First, I'd like to acknowledge all the traditional owners on where we're meeting today here in Alice Springs. It's Arnhem people and Daywurrwurr people. I'd also like to acknowledge in the same space as me at the moment is Marlene Hodder, Hilary Tyler, Valerie Martin, and Sylvia Neal, who are a part of the Intervention Rollback Action Group, and they're like over that way, and they're listening in and zooming in as well. I'd also like to acknowledge everybody who's been a part of our campaign fighting against the intervention since 2007, who is now no longer with us. And more recently is Mr. Jakamata Nelson from Yundamu, who was a very staunch campaigner against intervention. People of Yundamu actually took up a strong fight and held off on the intervention and government control out there. 14 years of the intervention. It was only supposed to be in place for 5 years to straighten out the Aboriginal lives and put us all on track and bring us up to standards like the rest of Australians here in Australia. But unfortunately, that never happened within the 5-year period that the intervention was set in place. Then in 2007, we also had an election which brought us a new government. And everybody knows the history of the intervention, where it came from and where it ended in with us having the stronger futures. So, yep, next year, stronger futures is supposed to end after 10 years. We don't know where that's going to lead us or take us next year. I know that wherever I go, wherever I'm meeting, whatever boardroom I'm sitting in, whatever other elders that I'm sitting with and leaders, they always seem to mention the intervention and how the intervention brought so much heartache, more than bettering our lives. I guess one of the main things is that, you know, people have always stood up against intervention and against stronger futures and against governments. As a town camper, we still suffer, still have police raids. We, you know, and same like in communities. And we all know that communities, outstations and town camps and organisations, we do get scrutinised and we do get stereotyped. We're all put into that one bucket where, you know, we're still being demonised and our men being stereotyped. And I know over the last 14 years, it hasn't stopped what it was supposed to prevent when it was first put in place. I guess now, for myself as a youth worker, I see more kids out on the streets. And I find that there are a lot of homeless children because our adults or families are also homeless. We still live in an overcrowding situation. I only work 3 days a week, which is good enough. That pays the rent because I have my own children to look after, as well as being a kinship carer. I still look after my family's children. So it is a heartache, you know. You still do the same thing, even though we don't get out on the streets as much, and COVID sort of helped that last year, you know, which didn't get a lot of people out on the streets. But in our own little ways, we still challenge the governments, whether we're meeting with them in our organisations or we're having direct face contact with them. And we know elections are going to be coming up, so they're always going to be coming out and looking for our votes. But it's better for us to keep the territory safe. But yeah, I can't really say much about my other hats that I wear, especially with Central Land Council as Deputy Chair. All I can say is that people aren't happy at all with the intervention still to this day. They know that they've mucked up so much stuff in the community. And people are feeling more disadvantaged because of the lack of funds that are going into communities, outstations, homelands, and into our organisations. And that's the biggest thing about being an Aboriginal person is, and being part of boards, is the lack of funding for our organisations that's supposed to provide a service for us. And I don't know, John might speak about it, but a clear example of that is, you know, Naja and Kayla's, for example, Carla, sorry, or you know, our medical health services not having enough staff out in remote communities, or, you know, CDP taken over by the Shire because it was scrapped under the intervention, and that made a lot of Aboriginal people unemployed and jobless. So they are actually struggling to get employment in communities. Yeah, I guess as an Aboriginal person living in a prescribed area, life hasn't changed so much for me, but I've managed to get by. I'm still on income management, even though I'm a deputy chair of a big statutory organisation. I work 3 days a week and I still attend meetings. I still do my reporting to Centrelink, and I do the right thing, and yeah. But at the moment, I think I'm slowly going towards, what have they got now coming through? Oh, the cashless debit card. So in Centrelink, on your Centrelink statement, that's also showing up on your income statement as 80%, 20%, just like it is on the cashless debit card. So many things have happened for myself personally as a growing and learning experience, and I've grown over the last 14 years, but I still manage to keep up the intervention fight when I'm talking with government and making sure that this is what you did and this is how we live. And the next step is now to talk to the governments, all tiers of governments, about what's to come of next year. And hopefully we won't have a stronger futures, and a lot of local decision making will be handed back to Aboriginal people to run their own affairs in their own communities. That's how I see a way forward, I guess. I don't know what else I can say. I would say a lot of things, but I don't, yeah. I can't hear anybody.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could, you mentioned changes that you wanted to see this time next year and the opportunity that presents. In addition to local decision making, what is kind of, if you could ask anything of the government in that period, what would your dream be to see this time next year at the end of Stronger Futures legislation?
I guess what I'd like to see, and while we've got the federal minister there, Ken Wyatt, as an Aboriginal man, I would like him to see hear a lot of our mob and get out into communities before the next federal election, because while he's there, I think we should use this opportunity as an Aboriginal man to start talking about what people want, especially around local decision making, and excuse me, and you know, building up their own strength in their own communities, because we know that it was a land grab in the start with compulsory land acquisition, you know. And that was to get all the services out there, apparently to get everything, and to build up our lives and that. And I think we should use this opportunity. And I believe that we did have a strong letter a couple of years ago, and I think we should revisit that letter, because I think it's up to discussion about certain things in the communities and in the Northern Territory especially, you know.
Just got one more question for you, if that's all right, before we hand the floor over to Greg. What do you think is necessary, I guess, at this point next year to support the well-being and sovereignty of mob that has been impacted by the intervention? What's it going to take to get back to that point that had existed before the intervention, and what kind of needs to happen?
Well, one of the main things is that I support is the convention that happened down at Uluru, around the Uluru Statement, and it was I'd gotten involved with 3 meetings, dialogues around the country, and I was also there in the room when the Uluru Statement was drafted. So what's in the Uluru Statement is what people had said around the country. And you know, it's a myth that it was drafted by a white man or a white woman. So there were over 300 people in that room that put it together. And I think it's that now to have that real discussion around treaties, having a Bill of Rights in our country, and just getting out there and educating our mob about what they need to do to stand up for themselves around the human rights issues and the Uluru Statement, because the Uluru Statement was drafted by over 300 Aboriginal people in Australia for the non-Aboriginal person to read, to sit around a kitchen table, to sit around with their friends and start discussing what the non-Aboriginal person needs to do to support an Aboriginal person like me to get on with my life. To not put me in a bucket that demonizes and stereotypes everyone, because we're not all the same. And we know that we do need support and support services out there for our mob that don't get the services or the help that they need. But because we're you know, family orientated, we always seem to be helping one another.
Mm. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm sure the audience is going to have a chance to talk with you a little bit further towards the end of tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Our second speaker is Greg Marks. And Greg Marks is a writer, researcher and advocate with long experience in Aboriginal issues and programs in the Northern Territory. He retains links with the Territory and is particularly concerned about the situation of outstation and homelands communities. Welcome, Greg. The floor is yours. I'm afraid, Greg, we can't hear you.
Okay, is that right? Can you hear me now? Okay. Somehow it got muted. I'll just start again and say thanks, Alison, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal traditional owners and custodians and all Aboriginal people associated with and connected to their land. I've got some notes here. I'll be referring to those, and I've rejigged them just a little while before I spoke, so I hope they still come out in a logical fashion. And if there are things here that don't quite make sense or people have got questions about, I'm happy to respond to those either in this session or afterwards, if people want to, by phone or email or anything like that. What I want to start saying is that, let's go back to the intervention legislation. So that was in August 2007. So everybody knows about that legislation. And pretty much everybody knows about the Stronger Futures legislation in 2012. Now, 1 month later, that August 2007, in September 2007, there was an MOU called, and I'll read the title out, the Memorandum of Understanding between the Australian Government and the Northern Territory Government on Indigenous housing, accommodation and related services. That's just 1 month later, but I'm not so sure so many people know about that. I mean, the people on the ground living it know about it, but as a public policy sort of position, I'm not sure the MOU and its implications are so widely known. And I think it's just as important as the actual legislation. But has been out of the public view. It's, to my mind, it's a hidden part of the intervention. And it's a policy, all right, but it doesn't appear in the NTR legislation. And if you want to find the policy, you have to hunt through innumerable COAG documents relating one small paragraph here to another small paragraph there, and it comes out, it's a policy. And the policy, as stated in the MOU, is for the Commonwealth Government not to provide any funds at all, ever, for homelands and outstations communities in respect of housing and housing-related infrastructure. The MOU said that there are about 500 outstation homeland communities. I'll just use those terms interchangeably. 500 when the MOU was signed, and I think about 12,000 or 15,000 people, I'm not sure now how many people there, and they were to be excluded forever from any Commonwealth support, except for some money for temporary money for interim money for recurrent expenditure. But when it came to housing or housing refurbishment or capital works related to housing, that was verboten from then on. It was supposed to be left to the Northern Territory Government, which first of all inherited a huge backlog, and secondly was never going to have the resources to take on that function, that responsibility. So I think that this sort of hidden part of the intervention has been disastrous for Aboriginal life in the Northern Territory in so many ways. So the key thing about that MOU, besides all the other information, is this ban on Commonwealth funding. And the MOU was kept secret. It wasn't even a public document, but it fell off the back of a truck, fortunately. And then Lanapoi attached it to a submission to a Senate committee, so it's now a public document. But the point I'm just wanting to emphasise is this, I think, is an integral part of the intervention, even though it's spoken about separately and seen separately. The two tie together for the same sort of purposes. I mean, and those purposes, as you all know, are basically to grind Aboriginal people down, to disempower Aboriginal people, and to assimilate Aboriginal people. Now, and if you look at the these are sort of policy documents, but if you look at the National Partnership for Remote Housing Northern Territory document, which covers the period 2018 to 2023, in that you'll see no mention of housing for homelands or outstations. It doesn't say they're excluded, it just doesn't have to, because that old 2,700 policy is still in place. Now, those directly affected by the policy have complained long and loud, Lanapoi, Yingiya Markuya, the land councils, many have complained, and some have made the link to the intervention, but there's been no change, in my view, whatsoever in that policy. That goes back at least 14 years. There has not been a new house built with Commonwealth funds on an outstation for probably about 15 years, maybe 16, despite the large number of people who live on homeland and who want to live on homelands. So the consequences, Barbara's referred to some of those. We don't need to dwell on those, but overcrowding, increasingly old housing stock. If A lot of houses are now 30 or 40 years old, and they're doing well under any conditions to hold up like they have. But it's just not viable. And it's also, of course, and very importantly, has been the population drift to the major communities and to the regional towns. And we all know the issues, social dysfunction and problems in the major communities and the towns. And it means the inability for many people to live on country with a reasonable level of services, including social housing. So that's the sort of situation that we've inherited and still runs strong in my view. Now, there was a development that looked like it might provide a way through. And that was that the Northern Territory government commissioned an independent review of Homeland's policy. And eventually, that after a long time, that policy review findings were released early this year. And the first recommendation was, I think, the particularly important one. So if you can bear with this reading from documents, the first recommendation was re-engage with the Australian government and land councils to develop a sustainable policy. So that is more or less bring the Commonwealth back in. And the NT government response, as the NT government commits to establishing a new body with land councils and the Australian government to engage and co-design a long-term vision for homelands, including a holistic homelands policy framework. So that looked sort of an opening to start to revisit this policy setting. But then it's all sort of gone quiet. You haven't heard much about it. There's no, apart from that Northern Territory government indicating its position, there doesn't seem to be anything else further much happened about it. Months and months have dragged on. Now, I think there's a reason for that, and that is because I think there's a new game in town, and that policy review is sort of being pushed to one side. So you see the new game, this is what Georgina was referring to, you see the new game in a press release that the former leader of the National Party, Michael McCormack, released at the Burrunga Festival. And that news release is headed Generational Reform to Empower Aboriginal Territorians. And it says that there will be, that the Morrison McCormack government has co-designed with the Northern Territory Land Councils a package of generational reforms to the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act to activate the potential of Indigenous land in the Northern Territory. And when you read that through, to my mind, when you read that through, this is a charter for development on Aboriginal land. And it's not a charter, it's going to set up a new corporation, a new statutory body, which will be funded from the ABA, which is, of course, is Aboriginal money anyway. And that corporation will then manage and control and own developments on Aboriginal land. But when you read that, and when you read the fact sheets on the National Indigenous Australians Agency website that talks about these changes, they seem to be very much oriented towards mining and other development, economic development. And there's not a single reference to housing, especially, and not a single reference to homelands in these documents. But this looks like the new game in town. And this is going to be put into effect by amendments to the Land Rights Act. Like Georgina said, one can read what we know of those amendments so far as further sidelining of traditional owners. I mean, this has been a tension in the Land Rights Act from the start because, there's three parties to the decision making. There's the land councils, well, the decision makers should be the traditional owners. The land councils should ascertain what the traditional owners want, and then instruct the land trust to fulfill those requirements. But there's a tension between traditional owners and the rest of the system all the time there. If you go back to the Reeves report before, the attempt was to undermine traditional owners. I think that game is always on. It has to be watched very closely. But the thing is, just looking at my notes here, so I think it's all about development, mining, head leases, that's another part of it, and with some crumbs, I think, for things like arts centres. There'll be some of the old remnants of the old ABA, the way it was for community support. So the big danger, to my mind, in this context, is that this is a new game in town, and that homelands and outstations are going to stay on the sideline. So they're going to be out of sight again. And this is, I think, what a lot of people want, actually, want to be cynical about it. But this is a sort of coming up to key time. We've got the legislation, Stronger Futures legislation coming to an end next year, but also you've got this new legislation coming in and these new arrangements, a new statutory body. So I think this is a critical time, and if outstations and homelands get left out again, then how, it could compound 15 years so far, what, another 15, 30 years down the track, and it's going to really constrain the development of outstations. It's been very constrained till now. They've been marginalised now, and my fear is that this is going to, at a critical time, happen again. So what I'm saying to everybody, I guess, is be really alert to hold the discussion about the intervention in with discussion about homelands and outstations. And looking at the Stronger Futures legislation, to keep reminding people that this is also about homelands and outstations, even though it doesn't say so, to sort of bind the two things together and keep the homelands and outstations right in focus, because otherwise they'll be sort of second cousins all over again. And I think that politically it's difficult, I think. I don't think even, I might make a political comment, I don't think at this stage the ALP is going to be as much help at this stage. They're to invest at a federal level in the constitutional entrenchment issue, which is very important, but that's where their focus is. I rang up some months ago the office of the Labor senator in the Northern Territory to see what's happening about their response to the Homelands Policy Review. They didn't know it existed. So I don't think there's a focus isn't there. And I think that's our challenge somehow is to keep that focus there and keep homelands there, and especially over this next year or so, this new legislation, et cetera, coming in. So that's about it, I think. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Greg. I just have one follow-up question for you today. Why is government policy, especially at the Commonwealth level, so especially hostile towards outstation and homelands communities?
Yeah, that's the issue, I think. At the territory level, I don't think there's that hostility, partly because of the electoral consequences. The homelands people are voters in NT elections. At the Commonwealth level, the policy all changed about 2004, 2005. And I think that was the influence of various writers outside of Parliament, outside of government, but had a big influence of the government at the time. Various right-wing commentators, the late Professor Helen Hughes, other people had a set against outstations and homelands, and they convinced people who are quite willing to be convinced that these things had to go. And the attitude taken, and I've heard it across the table, working as a consultant and across the table with the architects of these policies, who were quite, in those sort of discussions, quite blatant about what they're on about, is that they wanted to get rid of homelands and outstations. And they weren't going to force people physically out of them. They took the attitude, they can stay there, the old people can stay there, but it's the young people we're after. We're going to make it that they don't live in outstations and homelands. So I think there's a deep ideological assimilationist thing behind it. And I think that spreads even out of sort of beyond even very conservative people. I think some people who are, if I can say on the more progressive side, don't really get it about outstations and homelands either. They don't see these places as a basis for finding a role in modern society. They don't fit the closing the gap agenda in their minds. So there's not a lot of sympathy and support out there outside of the Aboriginal people who want it, who want to live on their own lands. So there's a sort of problem there too, I think. And it sort of came suddenly because government policy up to about 2004, 2005 had been quite positive about homelands and outstations, but then it just did a complete reverse and it's pretty much stayed there. There's been some rhetorical improvement. People realise they can't be too nasty about outstations and homelands. So some of the changes at rhetorical level have been a bit more positive, but there hasn't been a lot to back that up underneath.
Thank you very much, Greg. I think between yourself and Barbara, we have a really chilling illustration of the stakes and the systems that are at play. So I thank you both.
Okay.
Before we move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is David Shoebridge, and I just briefly want to check, David, that you're in the Zoom.
Yeah, I'm here, Alison.
Oh, hello.
Is that coming reasonably clear?
It is absolutely
Yep.
crystal clear. I'll just briefly introduce you and then the floor will be yours. David Shoebridge is a Greens MP in the New South Wales Parliament who works on campaigns including on Aboriginal justice and police accountability. David prioritises working directly with communities to ensure their voices are brought into Parliament. Hand it over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alison, and thanks for the invitation to speak to everybody tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm on Gadigal land here and pay my respects to those elders past, present and emerging. My workplace, the New South Wales Parliament, is also on Gadigal land, and so I speak to you as a Greens MP, as a member of the community, but also when you speak as a member of a parliament like the New South Wales Parliament, I think you need to acknowledge you're part of an institution that's a big part of the problem, has created the laws that have dispossessed First Nations peoples, taken their kids, continues to resource the police and the criminal justice system in the way it does, and continues to marginalise and disenfranchise First Nations people. So it's a challenge being a Greens MP in part of an institution like the New South Wales Parliament, but we do what we can to change the institution and to bring as much as we can First Nations perspectives into the work we do. And I also speak to you as a having been pre-selected by the party to lead the Senate ticket in New South Wales into the federal parliament, and there'll be, as this discussion has shown tonight, the very same challenges dealing with an institution like that, the New South Wales, the Australian Parliament and the Australian Senate. But I've got to say, in that work, I really do feel like we are well directed and empowered by colleagues like Lydia Thorpe and the work she's been doing federally, and I see Celeste Little on the in this conference as well, and I'd love to be working with her as well as a colleague in this. So I suppose I don't want to repeat anything that's been said as much as I can. And Auntie Barb, thank you again for telling the truth from On Country. I think the way you speak, the power of your advocacy, we need to get more of Auntie Barb out there telling the truth to the rest of Australia about what the reality of the intervention has been like, this sort of racist, direct, discriminatory action by our own government against First Nations peoples in the Northern Territory. So thanks Auntie Barb for again speaking that truth to power. Well, we all know it was based on a lie. The 2007 intervention, the military and police response rushed out even before the Little Children is Sacred report was delivered to the Parliament, based upon a lie about Aboriginal child rearing and child protection, which was blown out of the water within weeks by that very same report, which made it clear that the rates of child abuse in the Northern Territory were no different from the rest of the country. And indeed, what it was calling for was that community-led response, working with and empowering First Nations peoples, self-determination and strengthening of First Nations peoples in order to deal with crises that are largely produced by the discriminatory economic and political system that First Nations peoples find themselves in the Northern Territory and the rest of the country. And instead of that, what we got was whole-scale disempowerment, whole-scale removal of structures that were working and providing economic and collective empowerment for First Nations peoples, and a clearing away of legal and regulatory barriers to land theft and mining exploration and ultimately resource extraction from the Northern Territory. It was a very clear land and resource grab dressed up as a human rights humanitarian response. And that has played out in the 14 long and hard years that have been experienced by the Northern Territory since. And I think it's worth remembering the political dynamic that was at play in 2007. The lies about First Nations childcare practices, the exaggerations of a small body of evidence, some of which was manufactured for the purpose, and then that classic, I would say right wing, but some of this was adopted as well by the Labor Party. But that classic right wing distraction of politics and policies, trying to sort of steal the narrative in one direction, which was all allegedly about child protection, while using the state and legislation to achieve what they really want to achieve, which is that disempowerment, land grab, and resource grab. So consistent with 2 centuries of Australian history before that. The fact that the concept of the intervention was touted as a bipartisan program, I think has been part of the reason why 14 years on, we're still stuck with it, because there wasn't the courage to resist that violence in the first place. I mean, the Greens were against it, always have been, and spoken strongly against it. But the fact that Labor and the coalition backed it in at the start really entrenched this directly racist policy in a way that has been played out, over the last 14 years, and makes our task next year of actually unwinding it and removing it from the statute books all the harder. If we can then roll forward to 2012, when there was the first chance, 5 years on, the sunset clause was there, and it was the first chance to actually scrub the intervention off the statute books. And as we know, it was intentionally and deliberately racially discriminatory in 2007. In fact, they suspended the Racial Discrimination Act in order to put the police into those communities, in order to remove Aboriginal land ownership, and in order to discriminate against Aboriginal families and parents. There was a conscious and deliberate and legal suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act. We wind forward to 2012, Labor's in office, and then they then pretend to withdraw the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act, and at law they do. They say that the stronger futures package in 2012 was at least pretended to no longer be racially discriminatory, but in practice it was every bit as racially discriminatory as the full-blown intervention in 2007. Directly designed and directed at Aboriginal communities, directly designed and directed at Aboriginal families, directly designed and directed at Aboriginal land ownership. And we also saw the entrenchment of the basics card, which has had a direct racially target in the Northern Territory, with now 90% of the people on the basics card being Aboriginal First Nations people in the Northern Territory. I don't know if it's not designed to be racially discriminatory. It is, at least at law, it was always intended to be focused on and directed on and targeted against First Nations peoples. And if you look at the way it's played out, that's exactly what's played out. And again, it's worthwhile going back and looking at what was said in 2012 by Labor when they rolled out the this package. And I might just read from the minister's introduction to it, Jenny Macklin's introduction, when she was pumping out this particular project. She said, "Our 10-year, $3.4 billion commitment will see us continuing to invest to make communities safer and families and children healthier. We will be helping to create jobs in communities, supporting local people to get jobs, and giving people living in outstations and homelands certainty that support for basic services will continue. Complementing our new investment, our Strongest Future legislation will help us to work with Aboriginal people to tackle the issues that communities told us were the most urgent. Continuing to tackle alcohol abuse and the damage this causes, ensuring children go to school every day to get a decent education, and that parents play their part in making this happen." On pretty much every single indicator that the minister listed in that, there has been a dramatic deterioration. There had been a deterioration between 2007 and 2012. And in the 9 years since 2012, there has been a dramatic deterioration on every single indicator the minister was relying upon in trying to underpin this, her package of both misplaced funding and directly discriminatory legislation. And Greg made it clear, just on one of those, in terms of the support for people living in outstations, you know, just failed comprehensively. But literally every single indicator, whether it's school attendance, we've seen a dramatic reduction in First Nations kids going to school, rates of attendance in the Northern Territory. Meanwhile, white non-Aboriginal kids have seen their attendance rates increase. We have seen a chilling and distressing increase in youth suicides in the Northern Territory, which has directly tracked the intervention at putting youth suicides in the Northern Territory amongst First Nations kids, Aboriginal kids, at rates that are shameful on an international, any kind of international standing. In terms of making communities safer, well, actually, just so many more Aboriginal people are now in jail. If the Northern Territory was a country, it would have the second highest incarceration rate on the planet. And if you just looked at First Nations peoples in the Northern Territory, it would be far and away the highest incarceration rate on the planet. One indicator you can see that has been ticked in since 2012 is this ongoing and continued increase of police resources in First Nations communities. And as we know, that has been coupled with very deliberate legislative powers that basically give the police warrantless access to anybody's home in remote communities, Aboriginal homes, only Aboriginal homes, warrantless access to their communities to go in, pick out community leaders and basically have a rule of police-led terror in some of those communities. It's hard to comprehend that that's happening in a country like Australia, but of course it's happening in the Northern Territory, away from the observation of most mainstream media. And it's only when we get people like Barb come forward and tell us the truth about what's happening in the Northern Territory do we get a sense of the real impact of the intervention. And I could give a variety of other indicators, but any fair-minded assessment of this project would say it has been a disastrous failure. We know it was always going to be a disastrous failure because it always the answers in these communities is empowerment, self-determination, land, and treaty. And the intervention is exactly the opposite of all of those key features of any kind of sustainable progress in the Northern Territory. So how do we wind it back in the next 12 months? Well, I think what you're doing tonight, and I commend all of you for coming forward and doing this, and I commend all of those people who came out in rallies, small and medium-sized on the weekend against the intervention. We need to spend the next 12 months in telling the truth about the intervention. We need to spend the next 12 months in hopefully shaming Labor to finally accept that this was a disastrously destructive process. We need to find ways to platform speakers from the Northern Territory, like Auntie Barb and others, bring them into the mainstream media and prioritise their voices. But we should also make sure that it's part of the discussion in any upcoming federal election. What will parties do? Will they commit to actually returning land, returning power and delivering self-determination? And that must mean finally having the sun set on this terrible legislation next year in the federal parliament. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you, David. Just before we let you go briefly, could I ask you what you see as the main political obstacles to get positive change through in this subject?
Well, I think that the challenge has got to be in flipping Labor's position on it. And you know, that great tragedy in 2007 when in a moment of, you know, they could see that there was this clear political dynamic being run by Howard and his team, and they just gave into it without having any courage. I think it's got to be making it clear to Labor that there will be a political cost if they continue to extend, if they don't allow the sunset clause to set. Because unless it's clear that there'll be a real political cost to them, they will just roll it over because they are as interested in resource extraction as the coalition is at the end of the day. they are as persuaded by the big mining companies that they should have access to these resources and strip the royalties and wealth out of the Northern Territory as the coalition is. And they need to be made clear that there will be a real political price to pay if they don't let the sun set on this shameful policy. But I also think there's a harder task after that as well, which is how do you make good the damage of the last 14 years? What's the pathway to re-establishing First Nations control of their communities? How do we reclaim access and rights over land? How do we reassert those rights that have been lost in the last 14 years? And because there is a lot of damage to be undone as well.
Absolutely, David. Thank you. I might move to you now, John, and give you this brief introduction that I've just found in my many millions of papers. Sorry about that. So we're joined tonight by John Rawnsley, who is the manager of the Law and Justice section at the Northern Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, and he has a legal background. He is a director of the Northern Territory PHN and currently a deputy chair. John grew up in the Northern Territory, spending his time in his youth and in his adult, both in Darwin and Central Australia. He is from the Larrakia and Armageri groups. He has extensive broad experience, including as a current director of the Larrakia Development Corporation and Winkiku Rumbangi NT Indigenous Lawyers Aboriginal Corporation, and is also, if that's not enough, formerly a member of the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority, former alderman of Alice Springs, and deputy mayor. Thank you for joining us today, John.
Thanks, Alison, and it's good to see everybody too. And so I'm on Larrakia country at the moment, up in Darwin, and it's got down to about 19 degrees this morning, so it's pretty cold for us. And I see a lot of people here in jumpers. I've got my window open. My jumper is still in my drawer, but because it has been a bit cold, I've been thinking about getting it out, but we'll see how we go. And you know, I can't hear you all laugh because you're on mute, but I can see you smiling. So, and it's a bit unusual to sort of start off, you know, with a few jokes as well. I know this is quite tense. You know, you're involved in this stuff all the time, and it feels quite heavy. And that's just the nature of it. And I think just acknowledging, you know, we're an Aboriginal community controlled organisation and an Aboriginal legal service, and I work with a lot of Aboriginal staff, and I know that when reforms do take place, and you know, even recently, that impact Aboriginal people, that heaviness, you know, you can feel it because our people work directly, you know, with community on the ground as well. And I'm constantly reminded of their strength and how they inspire me and inspire others. And I see and I hear that tonight as well. And, you know, over many years as well, you know, when I used to live in Alice Springs and hearing Barbara talk about her role as a foster carer and caring for other kids, I guess I just want to acknowledge that too, because that same sort of strength, and Nala will speak about it later, when it gets heavy, it's that sort of strength that really inspires me, and it's something to acknowledge and to recognise as well. Just in the short period, I mean, what is the intervention? We know that as a single word, like the intervention, and it describes like a whole range of different reform efforts. You know, it's the political messages and the communications in relation to that. It's the law reform piece across lots of different areas, land, you know, criminal justice system, police, all sorts of things. And then I guess it's the tone, and it's that whole shift as well. And so I guess I speak from the law and justice sort of context. One part that's been really important that keeps on coming up is that the repeal piece is about the Crimes Act. So legislation was put in place in the time that really restricted Aboriginal circumstances in a court setting, and in terms of, you know, evidence, and in terms of things that the court should consider. And there was a recent report that came out from the Anti-Law Reform Committee that talked about sentencing and Aboriginality. And there's a lot of consultations that took place with that report. And, you know, there's lots of consultations that take place over the years, but there was some fairly strong views and unanimous views about repealing that legislation. but also a lot of interesting findings in terms of the language used about, 10, 14 years on, talking to a lot of Aboriginal people and reflecting on that whole shift in politics and what it means in terms of Aboriginality and the court system and the justice system, and how that intersects and what's the relationship in relation to Aboriginal law. And I encourage people to find that. If you Google it, it's from the Anti-Law Reform Committee. But if you just read the findings, it offers some really interesting language that I've found interesting in terms of how to explain some of those things. But also, when you reflect on the intervention in the law and justice system, there's so many multiple reports and inquiries and royal commissions that have a lot of really good evidence-based suggestions and recommendations. Many of those reports have simply been ignored. Like, they haven't even attracted a formal kind of government response. And there's a lot of substantial work there that should be the reform piece, that should be where the investments, should happen. And I guess that tone stems back from the Little Children Are Sacred report being ignored, and then, this other piece coming in. But you go back right from, Black Deaths in Custody to, the Pathways to Justice was an Australian Law Reform Commission report that's about 3 or 4 years old. And these are substantial reports that engage Aboriginal people and expert opinions about these matters that don't even get, the recommendations, many of which don't get adequate responses. And you contrast that with the law and justice system impacts Aboriginal people's lives in such a dominant way. The amount of sort of interactions at a police level, but also lots of different types of laws, child protection, and, we talk about CDP and we talk about welfare. There's so many different ways that the law and justice system impacts Aboriginal people in such a strong and dominant way, yet the investment in relation to Aboriginal-led solutions around resourcing Aboriginal-led responses and, integrating Aboriginal agency into that to ensure that that whole system is more culturally appropriate is very little and very small. And there's a really strong contrast between those two aspects. And that's sort of, when you reflect on that whole politics of the intervention, that journey reflects the tone that was set at that time. And another important point to make is that because the law and justice system is so dominant in Aboriginal people's lives, we know from the evidence that interpersonal discrimination, the discrimination that Aboriginal people face just by engaging with other people and what they receive, it impacts mental health, it impacts health. And the studies, there's overwhelming evidence that points to that. When we talk about a justice system that has very small Aboriginal agency built within it and resource investment in those solutions, whereas our prisons, 84% Aboriginal people in prison, the Aboriginal female prison population is amongst the fastest of any group, growing in the world. We've got amongst the highest imprisonment rate that Aboriginal people face compared to any group within the world. Our youth detention centres are often 100% Aboriginal. So when you've got those sorts of characteristics, and then you've got so little investment in Aboriginal-led solutions, that's what, and this whole colonial approach of ignoring report after report after report that builds on Aboriginal and expert opinions, that reflects a sort of colonial journey, but also systemic and institutionalized discrimination. And it's very difficult to build an evidence base in relation to systemic and institutionalized discrimination, but there's a direct link there, right? And we don't have that reform piece that has happened. Sometimes we get glimpses of it, and sometimes we get statements and, a refresh or a reimagining or a resetting. And sometimes we get these words about potentially shifting. But in terms of, substantive reform and investment, you work long enough in the law and justice space that you easily become, I guess, disenfranchised or disenchanted. And again, you know, that whole tone reflects, I guess, that journey as well. I guess just to end, you know, what's the sort of solution? What's the piece to try and get real and genuine change? And it is looking at those reports, and it is focusing on a lot of those reform efforts. You know, CDP, APONT, which is the Aboriginal People Organisation, NT, developed, and, you know, with the land councils and others, developed a comprehensive proposal that related to jobs and welfare. You know, if you look at structural reform, there's a lot of potential in terms of all of the investment in, you know, the justice system, or whether it's out of home care or, you know, support for Aboriginal children. There's a lot of potential to shift that to sort of Aboriginal control and have Aboriginal people control in terms of the decision making of where that investment should go. But I also think that it's not just about this message around before the intervention. We need to return to those things, because we've got a colonial legacy built into the system that was there before and continues and has been exacerbated in many ways. So I think it's also about that structural, like that reform piece. If you look at the Self-Government Act, for example, like that sets our politics, it sets our structure. I don't think we have enough discussion around the importance of looking at some of those fundamental things and changing it. And so I guess I want to sort of put those sorts of things on the table as well. Like how many times do you go through a process of a cycle where you have reports and inquiries and investigations and then outcomes and recommendations, and then not following through with them or ignoring them? How many times do you go through that cycle without, you know, saying loud and clear that there needs to be fundamental change to that whole system that allows that to happen? So yeah, that's how I want to finish off. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I wonder if I could, I know you said you wanted to finish off, but if I could draw you on one particular question.
Yeah.
We have a lot of lawyers or legal professionals, people in this kind of industry or discipline or space who are listening tonight. What do you think their role can be in shaping what happens over the next year and beyond?
I mean, that's a really good question. It's tricky. It's a tricky thing to think about in terms of, like, I imagine the people who are here want to see change and want to make change happen. I mean, we're doing a lot of work in relation to education programs for lawyers, for law students. And starting at that earlier piece, you know, we've got something like 80,000 lawyers in Australia, and the system works in a way where peak bodies often support the causes that we support. You know, for example, those recommendations in all of those reports. But it's the tens of thousands of other people who are indifferent to it, or accept that whole structure as it is, or for whatever reason aren't engaged in that focus of seeking that fundamental change. And trying to see change in that area is really a challenging thing. I mean, one example of a program that we're driving is to take take law students out on country to engage with a range of Aboriginal voices, because that's how you learn about law, and it's verbal and it's direct. You allow the country to speak, you engage with a whole range of different people within that system. And that's where you can develop up that whole ethical piece around shifting and driving change. So if there's lawyers here who are listening, then you can look at the NAJA website and see some of the work that we're doing. It's only early days still, but our vision is that, you know, that's the only way to teach Aboriginal issues in law schools and things like that. So it's those sorts of, and again, you know, this is the tricky thing too, because we know this word intervention, we know what it means because of that whole context, but that's just something that's been constructed, right? That word has just been, that whole label in terms of its meaning to point to that, you know, the intervention period It's just something that got created from that political event. But that notion of intervening is something that's really needed. And it's sort of been hijacked. It's sort of been shifted to this other meeting. And we don't even have the sort of shared language and understanding around, yes, there's a particular problem there. We need to intervene and have this sort of, solution or this response. So it's an example of, I guess, an education program that's intervening at that student level to impress upon people that whole ethical piece about belonging and what it means in Australia. So yeah, that's just it's a quick response. There's a lot more we could talk about it, but yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking on that curveball. Our final speaker for tonight is Celeste Little. And Celeste, who to me needs no introduction, but I will proceed anyway, is an Arunda woman who lives in Melbourne, a unionist, a feminist, an opinion writer, a social commentator, and current Greens candidate for the seat of Cooper. Celeste, thanks for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming into all of your living rooms and all that tonight from Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and identify myself as an Arunda woman, as Alison said, and an Mbantwanya. So, yeah, and also acknowledge that the Wurundjeri people have never ceded their sovereignty, that a treaty or sovereign agreement is yet to be negotiated for use of these lands. And until that injustice is rectified, as a visitor on these lands, I pledge my solidarity both to their struggle for justice, but also to the struggle for justice back on my own homelands. I'm going to be very honest, straight up. I'm probably the least prepared of the speakers, and that's because I was only able to confirm at the very last minute. But I'm here, and I'm, I think it got to 4 degrees overnight here, John. So, I'm just feeling a little bit more cold here. There's 2 heaters and several jumpers. But I guess I want to start just kind of by saying that I can't actually believe that we are on a video conference talking about the intervention 14 years on from when it happened. I find that fact despicable and repugnant, and just, it says an awful lot about this country and how it works and who runs it, who's been running it, and how the greater Australian public has allowed what is a massive human rights abuse. And there's no other way to, well, there's plenty of other ways to describe it, but that's the first way I'll describe it. They've allowed a massive human rights abuse to continue for 14 years. But I think what I really, I've got a number of notes here about little bits and pieces that occurred to me, and I really didn't want to double up on what other people were saying, because there's been some incredible contributions. And I wanted to acknowledge Barb there, who has been on the front lines, my sister there, continuously since the beginning, trying to get people to listen, to acknowledge, to do something about what was going on. And she was doing so at a time when the media was really deliberately seeking out, Aboriginal voices who weren't living under the intervention, who they could roll out to say that, community people supported it, and talking about, I guess basically using certain Aboriginal people, whether it was, people who lived in towns, or people who were divorced from the situation in some way, or people who provided an acceptable face to justify the government's actions. So from Bruff Annie's crocodile tears, which was done at the 11th hour of a dying Liberal government. Like, this is a cynical government that knew it was on its way out, had done nothing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights for the entire time that they'd been in. In fact, they'd continuously tried to remove our stories and our education and that from anything. So the 11th hour attempt to look like they were doing something and hold on to power, and they failed. And then we get the apology, you know, which was this wonderful, warm moment that, you know, as someone who has many stolen gen members in her family, you know, for a bit there, I got to feel a little bit of hope. I thought, you know, oh, maybe we might move forward from this point. But, you know, straight away they denied compensation for any of the members of the stolen generations. And then after the 5 years trial, as nearly everyone else on the panel has said, ended with the intervention, we ended up with stronger futures. And then we ended up with the Gillard-led, you know, administration talking about rivers of grog running through the Northern Territory, and again, demonising populations who for years had had these grotesque signs out the front, you know, no grog, no porn, no anything else out the front, you know, trying to other and state that these, beyond this point, live a bunch of people of ill repute. And they need to be guarded, and they need to have, you know, they need to have all of their affairs managed. They need to be policed to the hilt. They need the army sent in. Yeah, that rhetoric continued. And I guess, you know, the one thing that I'm really concerned about, because, yeah, next year will mark that time being up, and we're looking towards the future. I guess what I am deeply concerned about is the fact that the sorts of programs that have been rolled out in the intervention, so whether it was basics card or, you know, even, well, I'll talk a little bit about the CDP in that, but, you know, things like that, those sorts of programs that we've seen rolled out during the intervention, you know, we've seen these bad policies, and anyone in the crowd who has any sort of grasp on post-colonial history in this country and how it's worked will know what I'm talking about. But what's happened over and over again with the intervention is that a bunch of bad policies have been trialled on Aboriginal people first, and then they've been taken to more mainstream communities. So the basics card and welfare quarantining measures all of a sudden end up being, you know, going down to South Australia and then being trialled in other communities, and then, you know, essentially privatized for profit. So these programs can be run for the benefit of wealthy mates of current governments. So some of the most vulnerable people in the country are being continuously surveilled, having everything, all their spendings watched and being monitored, and it's being justified. People, the Australian public seem to be okay with this, and there only ever seems to be some outrage when it gets closer and closer to impacting more white people. Never mind the fact that, you know, Aboriginal people, and particularly Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory who live in homelands. And I think that a lot of people who've never been to the Territory, and I can't count just how many of them I've encountered in Victoria who still seem to think of the Northern Territory as this faraway place that they've never actually villaged and visited rather, and they've got no grasp on. So the politicians will exploit that. They'll exploit people's ignorance of the Territory. They'll use those romanticized visions of homelands and cultures and all of that, and therefore this assumption that people do need to be managed in order to push through these sorts of measures. But when you see them being pushed out to further populations, and we're seeing welfare quarantining do that as we speak, I do wonder when mainstream Australia is going to learn. I also wonder that with the CDP, we've had promises that the community development program will end in 2023. If I'm incorrect, please, someone shake their finger at me now, because it's been a long day. But, we've had promises from the current government that that program will end and a new program will be set up in consultation with the communities. It strikes me that I wonder if we're just going to end up back in a vicious sort of cycle thing. I don't want to, I'm really aware that I'm sounding all negative being the last speaker, but one of the first things that the intervention did was remove a bunch of self-determined programs from the communities and state that you need to, you need to have all these managed. And then they brought in the CDP a couple of years down the track as a way of stopping sit-down money, whatever that is, and engaging people in work that, in a lot of cases around the country is what would normally just be considered as council work and be adequately compensated, but would also attract things like superannuation, like occupational health and safety legislation, like, annual leave, sick leave, family leave, cultural leave, all these sorts of provisions that a lot of people in jobs across this country simply take for granted. What I wonder is, if the government is planning to wind back CDP. Oh, and sorry, I did forget too, they also open up CDP to private enterprise. And why on earth, I'm trying to wonder why a lot of people in this country weren't questioning that. That if a private enterprise that is for profit has access to an endless pool of Aboriginal labour that they don't have to pay for, and they just sign on a line in order, as a provider of CDP, and they've got people who can work part-time hours year round, and they can report them and penalise them and whatever else, then why on earth, where is the incentive to hire any single Aboriginal person in the program? Where's the incentive to grow jobs in the region? There is none, because they've got an endless pool of labour that the government's allowing them to feed in all the time. And somebody remarked in the chat before that it was glorified work for the dole, and that's absolutely what it was, completely what it was. But what I'm scared about is the same pattern that we've seen with welfare quarantining, which is that this has now been normalised for an entire section of the population. So how long until we see CDP measures rolled out across some of our more vulnerable, populations all across the country? How long until this just becomes the accepted norm? And who's going to question that? Who's going to stand and stop the government from doing that? And I think there is one final thing that, maybe it's not a final thing. One thing that I do need to make clear, I think I've already alluded to it, but, if you've got the Howard government bringing in the intervention, and then you had the Labor government, the Rudd-Gillard Labor government continuing it under a different name, can we actually trust either side, either one of the major parties, to do the work of rolling back the damage that the intervention has done? And it has done so much damage, it's sort of, I think of family members and how the intervention started driving wedges with, between families, because some of them been on quarantining measures and some wouldn't. and it created fighting against the haves and the have-nots within communities. I think of, I wrote many years ago, there were water supply issues out on Utopia homelands, and I noticed we got a few from those areas in the chat today. But there were, water supply issues to communities. Apparently they were supposed to be taking care of housing and, infrastructure, and these sorts of things were supposed to be the grand rollout of the intervention. They were coming in force to ensure that these supplies were going on, that people, that people needed protecting, or whatever it was that they were saying at the time. One of the things that I wrote, and I was going back over a couple of my old articles that I've written over the years to grab stuff from, but prior to the intervention, there'd been studies done on Utopia homelands that showed them to be one of the healthiest populations, not just in Aboriginal communities, but across the entire country. And those sorts of health indicators started to go backwards within the intervention. We saw a lot of health indicators go back under welfare quarantining, access to fresh fruit and vegetables, and the fact that a lot of people in communities are paying 4 or 5 times the amount that what someone in the city will pay for a litre of milk. And then COVID hitting last year and further impacting supply of stuff out to communities. So people were really struggling. There was another article that I went back over, which was talking about access to supplies, but was looking at the fact that there were schools that years after the intervention had come in were just completely run down, didn't have working bathrooms, and they were wondering why kids weren't going to them at certain times. I just find all of this gobsmackingly bad. And I guess I don't see an awful lot of it changing unless there's 2 things. One is that we've got some people who are able on the floor of Parliament, where these decisions are made and impact the lives of thousands, to actively challenge it when they see this appalling legislation, to speak out and speak out strongly against it. The other is through treaties. I keep on people, a lot of my mob back home and all that will talk about, Aboriginal people needing to be in control of our own affairs. We hear that same rhetoric down here in Melbourne. We hear it all across the country. It's that same sort of talk about self-determination. In my opinion, I think that needs to be non-negotiable. It's not something we need to just be in control, but I think that control, the control over our own lives, the rights to make decisions as communities, the rights to operate services, the right to be supported in that needs to be absolutely, well, the right to land, the right to water, the right to, a whole heap of other languages, cultures, all of these things actually need to be non-negotiable, and they need to be protected through a rights document like a treaty, or treaties, I should say, because at this point in time they're not, and governments can continue to enact these sorts of things on top of people and take people's rights away from them via the removal of various sorts of by the removal of the Racial Discrimination Act, or for their own good sort of legislations that continually pass on the floor of Parliament. So yeah, I guess that's where I'm at. I really hope that next year we will start to see a lot of this stuff round back, and we start to see some of the damage that's been done to communities up there be undone. But I don't think that we're going to see that happen without a pretty strong fight, and that's a sad fact.
Thank you, Celeste. And I know you apologize for being the final speaker and for having that, I suppose, grave view, but I think it's really critical for us. I had a follow-up question for you, but I think I might have to leave it because we're quickly running out of time. Something I might like to pose to the speakers as one final chance to get your last word in is, what do you want everybody here today to do? What's one way that they can take action on everything that you've shared with them?
So I think, I mean, a lot of people probably already do this, but I mean, we appreciate your time, coming and just listening to all these different perspectives. And yeah, it is that doing piece, like that action piece as well, to support. But individuals have to identify what that is themselves, and try and focus on where I can make a difference. And our resources as individuals can be quite small as well, like in terms of thinking, how can I make the greatest impact? But individuals just need to identify that themselves, and identify those allies and networks and supports, and work out what's that action piece. And a lot of that is impressing upon others that same thing as well, and it is a big challenge. And I saw one of the comments there from in the email that was communicated about this event from Nala's mother Rosie, around how we are not the problem, and that places an obligation or responsibility on that broader system as well. That, I mean, this is the intervention is how the system was designed, right? Colonialism was designed this way, and so there's a lot of power within right across that. And so yeah, I just wanted to finish like that. Thanks.
I guess from my side and my views, I guess I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, supporting our mob in remote communities and homelands where they can't and don't have a voice. I'm going to at least show their support and making sure that somebody is listening. And when I sit at that top level, I guess I speak directly to government officials and making sure that people aren't happy on what's going on, and over the last 14 years, and just showing support to our fellow countrymen where it's needed. Because as long as there are people out there that's going to have a conversation around a dinner table about the disadvantage of this country, it is shameful not knowing what's going on in their own backyard. And you got people more like myself and like Auntie Valerie here, that still stands up and talks in their communities when we're having government official meetings on our communities, or in our boardrooms. We always reflect right back to 2007, where federal government made it harder for Aboriginal people on a daily basis, and our livelihoods, and the cost of living and everything. So as long as I got somebody like Auntie Valerie who lives out at Yolŋu, and if she says it's hard living out there, well, I'm going to repeat to the rest of Australia, well, it's hard for people living at Yolŋu. And I know that for a fact because my family who lives on an outstation are struggling. We haven't had a house renovated or new house built over 20 years. And we're just living in, my people on my homeland are just living in shells. And we're a country, we live in a country that's a signatory to 7 UN conventions, and yet they can sit in United Nations and say they do a lot, they do the best they can for Aboriginal people, but clear evidence that it's not working. And I think that's another step that people need to do, because even scrapping the Racial Discrimination Act for Aboriginal people here in the territory alone to put a policy just on us, it clearly showed with COVID, with our fellow Indian Australians, that not letting them back into Australia because of COVID is clearly racist in that area as well. And nobody should be afraid of people of colour, because we're always working together. We're your clients, you're our clients, so this is a country that we all should be living in harmony. And we celebrated, Harmony Day this year, ending racial discrimination, but racial discrimination still happening today. So just going to fight on different many levels and do as best as I can, I guess. And that's what everyone else needs to do.
Well, we'll do our best. Thank you so much. Celeste, I think you're the last one again.
Look, I'm going to just really quickly say, I think the best thing that people can do is listen and signal boost. And, I was talking just before about the wedges that were driven, and there's a purposeful wedge that's also driven between bush and town, town and city, city and capitals, central versus east, and then black and white, and it's all going on all the time. And I don't know how many times I've told people in various forums that there's so much expertise out there on the grounds, that there's people in the communities who know exactly what they do, what's needed, they know what needs to be taken care of. They have the expertise, they have the knowledge, and they need to be spoken to, they need to be listened to. And then people need to stay, people should go in and start fighting for what it is that they're saying that they need to get up, rather than any notion of a government coming in and intervening. It always should have, any sort of measures should have been done using the expertise that was on the ground there in the first place. If there was a problem, the expertise had already fed back via as many reports as what John was talking about and what so many others have been talking about. People have already done that work, and there are the voices and there is the knowledge, and and ensuring that I guess we've got to hold the people who make these decisions to pass these legislations accountable for when they don't go out there and they don't talk to the people and they don't then build programs around what is actually needed.
Absolutely. At the risk of taking anybody else's time on a Monday night, I just want to offer the following wrap up. I want to thank, first of all the speakers for their generous contributions during this time. And I also want to thank the audience who made the time and the commitment today to know more deeply and to hear quite deeply from the speakers that we had today on the issues surrounding the imposition of the intervention and what we can do to put it to an end. We hope for a different future where the full prior informed consent of First Nations peoples informs any laws that they have an interest in, and where their sovereignty is front and center. And we want to honor the many First Nations voices over these 14 years so far who have spoken out, raised awareness, and taken their pleas to the United Nations. And we know this doesn't come easily, and we know this comes at great personal cost. Australia stands condemned by the United Nations for the imposition of the intervention. And from tonight's discussion and the previous sessions of the conference yesterday, we know that the solutions to what is happening in the territory through the intervention lay with the people who have borne their brunt these many years. It is time to honour the commitment that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples means, and that is through full, prior and informed consent and recognition of sovereignty. So thank you so much for having me. Kathy, I hand over to you for the final words. I think you're on mute, Kathy.
Oh, hi. Sorry to do that. Look, just yeah, from the bottom of the hearts of everyone in the audience, thank you. It's been a privilege to listen. We just listed some ideas of support, so I'll just run through them. These are dot points that we had together at First Nations Lives Do Matter. Participants online may wish to raise concerns regarding the intervention with your Member of Parliament and Minister Ken Wyatt and the Prime Minister. Call for an end to the intervention and the right to self-determination, encourage people to become more involved in speaking out against the intervention laws, maybe create a petition just by listening. I know we've educating ourselves, but there's so much we could do. I know people, the way that you can save a chat is cut and paste it, because there was so much even in this chat tonight. So please keep in contact with Concerned Australians or the Intervention Rollback Action Group or Stop the Intervention Collective through our websites. And we hope to have this forum up as a YouTube link, and you'll find that on our websites. Takes just a little while to get there. Recommended viewing, Our Generation and Utopia. Recommended reading, Why Warriors Lay Down and Die, the Intervention Anthology, which is a Concerned Australians publication, and they have several great publications on their website. The Arena 2012 Intervention issue, and Melinda Hickson and John Altman's editorial in that Arena issue. So my wrap up is that brings this forum to conclusion, and thank all the speakers, and thank the audience for their time and commitment to know more deeply the issues surrounding these laws. We hope for a more enlightened future where I think maybe Alison, I might be repeating from you, but yeah, where First Nations people have full, prior and informed consent about any laws that affect them. Okay, yes, I've come to the right part. Sorry about that. I urge the audience to take action in support of this, to meet with politicians of all persuasions, hold them to account for the futures of the intervention policies, and to get their commitment to a future where there is community empowerment and respect for human rights of all First Nations people in the country. And I urge you to raise awareness in your own communities. This event has been recorded. I've already said that, so you'll find them on the website. And really, thank you and good night, everyone. And let's, in solidarity, let's make sure we don't see those laws again. We hold governments to account. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Yalu.
Thanks. Thanks, Barbara Shaw.